In this video, we're going to talk about using the routing middleware component. In the previous video, we completed these endpoint handlers with the endpoints middleware component. But when we try to run it, it throws an exception because it says that we need to use the routing middleware. Let's go back to our diagram first. So this is the diagram that we talked about in the previous video. We have these endpoints, just like in the diagram, right? But we didn't configure the routing middleware. So we're missing this part. Let's go into Visual Studio right now and try to just apply that routing middleware. And it's really, really easy. You can just say app.use routing, and that's it. That's our routing middleware here. Now, applying this is easy. Understanding it is another story, which is still easy, but we need to cover that. So let's go into this diagram again. So we have already placed the routing middleware in front of our endpoint middleware. So remember, this sequence is very important. We have learned middleware, and you know that where you place a middleware component is very important because middleware components are actually executed one after another. The order is very important. We always need to place the routing middleware before our endpoint middleware. So what does routing middleware do when we place that in front of our endpoint middleware? Remember in the previous video, we have talked about the identities of endpoints. Each endpoint has its own identity, and identity is supposed to be uniquely identify an endpoint. So that identity is roughly done by the combination of the method, right, the HTTP method, and the URL path. We will talk about the URL path later. It's not just the URL. The URL itself contains many parts. So I leave more than one part, not just the URL itself. But for now, we can just say that, okay, it's a combination between the method and the URL. So let me enlarge this font. So each endpoint has this combination, right? Because of that, how it works is that when ASP.NET Core executes the routing middleware, the code is already compiled, right, on the server. So it will be able to find, or at least go through all of the middlewares and check each one of the middleware and find all of the endpoint handlers and check each one of its combination between method and URL, right? So this is what I call identity. It checks the identity and then try to find a matching between the request and the identity of an endpoint handler. Once it finds a matching, then it will record the information about this endpoint handler inside HTTP context object. This is what the routing middleware does. Right? All of that, what I talked about just now, is what the routing middleware does. It tries to match the request to the identities of the endpoint handlers. And then once it finds one, for example, number 2, then it will record the information of endpoint number 2 inside the HTTP context. And that's what is done by the routing middleware. And I'm going to show you right here. So let's go back to our web application. And then what I can do is that before the routing middleware runs and after routing middleware runs, I can show you. Okay, so here I can use the use method here. And then I'm going to try to show you what is inside that HTTP context. Okay, before I do that, I'm going to call the next method so that our routing middleware can be called in the next turn. So here I'm going to say await next, and I'm going to pass the context object into it. And then I'm going to copy and paste that right over here so that we can set a breakpoint in here as well as in here. And then we can see what differences the routing middleware does. What we anticipate is that the context object is going to be changed by the routing middleware so that the selected endpoint will be recorded in the context object. Let's run the application and observe what's going to happen. As you know, let's run through this without checking anything. So this is the application. We are loading the root path, but we don't have anything that corresponds to that path, right? So in our use endpoints, we don't have a endpoint that actually handles the root path. Everything handles the employee's path. That's why I run through that without checking anything. So let's go to /employees, and then we're going to check the context object. So what we are going to check is, so I'm going to do right click, and then I'm going to do quick watch. And then here we are going to look at this endpoint object. See, it's null, which means an endpoint is not selected yet. Remember the responsibility of the routing middleware? It is try to match the request to an endpoint and then select that endpoint and record that in the context object. So let's go ahead and just run to here. So I'm going to just continue. Now, again, we're going to examine the context object. And now if you look at this endpoint, you can see that an endpoint is no longer null. So something is there. So who did the job? The routing middleware did the job. It populated the endpoint object, right? It has a display name, and you can see that the display name is a combination of the HTTP method and the path. So that's what I say. This is the identity of the endpoint. Imagine that you have two endpoint handlers that has the same identity. The routing middleware is going to throw exception because it doesn't know which endpoint to actually select. Right? Selecting an endpoint is not just about recording the name. It is also, you can see that it says a request delegate. So with this endpoint object here, ASP.NET Core can actually invoke the selected endpoint just by using this endpoint object because it contains the delegate, right? So if you have two endpoint handler that has the same identity, which means the method and the path are the same between the two, then the routing middleware is not going to be able to identify the request delegate. Therefore, it's going to fail, right? So context.endpoint is the object. Usually you would use a method. If you really want to get it in the code, what you need to do is to use the method getEndpoint, and it's going to give you the same thing. So we can try to do that right here in the immediate window here. We can say context.getEndpoint. And if you do that, it returns you everything like this, right? Which shows you that we have what we need. And if I continue, guess which endpoint here is going to be triggered? Or maybe I should use the word invoke. So which endpoint handler here is going to be invoked? It's going to be this particular one. Why is that? Because we're using a browser, and the browser launches a GET request, a HTTP GET request. So let's continue. All right, so we see get employees. And if we use our Postman, let's go over here, then we can try to invoke the other endpoints. So let's say we go to add employee over here. And because we created a new application, so the port number is different. So what is the new port number? 5291. So let's copy and paste that into our Postman. And you call it, and you can see that this breakpoint is again executed. I'm gonna remove the breakpoint, and we can see 200 OK over here, and it says create an employee, which means that we triggered our endpoint. So we're gonna do the same thing with update, which is the HTTP put. So we're going to send a request, and you can see update an employee. Okay. We also have a delete employee. It's not going to delete anything. It's just going to hit the endpoint method. It doesn't do anything except returning this message. Okay, so as you can see, we're able to use our routing middleware, and the routing middleware successfully selected the endpoint, this one by default for the browser, based on the identities of each. And you also learned how to access the endpoint object in the HTTP context object. And that's everything I want to cover in this video. Right? Remember that just because the HTTP context object contains the endpoint object, it enables all of the rest of the middlewares, built-in middlewares, as well as custom middlewares, to have access to this endpoint. So for example, authentication and authorization is going to be based on the endpoint object. It has to know which endpoint that the user is trying to access before it tries to authorize, right? Because different endpoint has different permissions. So it has to know which endpoint is going to be executed. Then it can determine whether the user has permission to access the endpoint. So that's why you need to consider the ordering, right? You have to use the use routing method. Place the routing middleware at this place. Use this first, and then all of the other middleware that depends on the endpoint after this method, so that they have access to the endpoint object in the context object. And that's what I want to show you in this video. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, I will see you in the next one.